The second part of the show last week was the rebroadcast of a conversation I had with journalist Paul Street shortly before President Obama's first inauguration as president 5.5 years ago. Paul Street is an independent journalist, policy advisor, and historian. Formerly, he was vice president for research and planning at the Chicago Urban League and observed Barack Obama up close in action before most of us ever heard of him. Later, Street was in Iowa for the primaries leading up to Obama's nomination. He wrote a book, Barack Obama and the Future of American Politics, that was published in 2008, and that's what we talked about on his first Tell Somebody appearance. Of that book, British-Australian journalist and filmmaker John Pilger wrote, "All those interested in truth rather than seduction should read urgently this wise book by Paul Street, who peels away the mask of the Obama phenomenon as it is, not as many of us wish it to be." Black Agenda Report Executive Director Glenn Ford wrote, "Paul Street offers perhaps the most clear-headed and meticulously researched dissection yet of the career of the current president, along with a frank assessment of the possibilities, good and not so good, in an Obama administration." Paul Street got so many things right 5.5 years ago, I thought it was high time to have him on the show again. I called Paul Street in Iowa City this past Monday, Memorial Day, and recorded this conversation. Give a listen. Paul Street is an independent researcher, journalist, historian, author, and speaker based in Iowa City and Chicago. He's written 7 books. I first came across him in between the first inauguration and election of Barack Obama, and had him on the show and was struck by how many things he got right then that so much of the media still doesn't get 6 years on. Since then, he's written The Empire's New Clothes, Barack Obama, and The Real World of Power, and They Rule, the 1% versus Democracy. Paul Street, welcome back to Tell Somebody.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here on this Memorial Day.
Yes, we are recording this on Memorial Day. Happy day to you. In your first book, I believe it was, you wrote about what Lawrence Shoup called the hidden primary of the ruling class. I wonder if you could just explain what that's all about.
Well, there's a kind of a marionette theater that's played out for us called electoral politics, and most dramatically at the presidential level, but at all levels, really, where the issues focus a lot on personalities, identity, racial identity, quirks, partisan identity, which party are they running for, and it's kind of a horse race, and who's ahead and who's behind, and, it's there's a lot of microscopic coverage of every little thing that a candidate might have said, and that's all sort of for the public consumption. And we get that every 4 years in this country. And then there's the real selection process, which takes place sort of behind the scenes, a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, right? Who's really pulling the machines? It's the marketing experts. It's the money. It's the campaign finance. You can't even think about running for Congress anymore for less than millions of bucks. What would he have? Just had the first $2 billion presidential election or something like that, close to it. The money involved is really determinative. Particularly in a country where we've got essentially carte blanche for private funded elections. Of course, we did have some public financing in the presidential election, and Obama had so much private money, he decided to blow right through it. In 2008, McCain was willing to abide by the campaign spending limits for the presidential public financing system. Obama said he was willing to, too, and then he ended up having so much private money that he lied his way out of it and blew right through it. So you don't ever become a serious candidate really with a chance of winning. It's viable. That's just one of the key words. Without backing from big Wall Street and big corporate sponsors, and without a lot of approval. It's kind of another hidden primary by the corporate media, which, you know, in itself, in turn, is owned pretty much by what we now call the 1%, the wealthy class Americans. And if you don't play by their rules, you can pretty much forget about it. So, well, I think that's pretty much what we mean by the hidden primary, and it's nothing particularly new. But these candidates that are finally, as they're whittled down and presented to us as our quote unquote choices, particularly the ones that have a serious chances of winning. So I don't mean Ralph Nader, I don't mean Judith Stein, I don't even mean John Edwards in 2008, who never really had a chance outside of Iowa. Anyway, I mean the Obamas and the Clintons and the Bushes and so forth. They've been whittled down. That field has been vetted, thoroughly vetted, and interviewed and checked out to make sure that they are safe for concentrated wealth and safe for concentrated power. Even though they might seem to be, or their branding or their imagery or their marketing might seem to be kind of progressive and democratic and populist, kind of like Obama in a way. But the vetting process means you really have face-to-face meetings with this candidate. You've checked into his background, what he's really about beneath the marketing, and you understand that he's safe for power, safe for concentrated wealth, safe for the 1%, safe for the military system, the empire, the Pentagon budget that eats up, the American empire budget that counts for half of the military spending on planet Earth. Talk about that on Memorial Day. After he's been through that, he or she, I should say she now, that's with the sort of inevitability of Hillary in 2016, after they've been vetted and shown to be safe, then we get to vote for them. And our voting takes place around a whole bunch of other things, like race was a big factor in '08, or what's their position on gay marriage, or what's their position on some relatively minor aspect of policy when there's a consensus between them on the really big fundamental underlying issues. Who owns the country and who rules it.
I'd like to read a quote here that was in the Kansas City Star yesterday on the Sunday opinion page. Local columnist Steve Rose wrote in part, "The nation needs a strong check and balance to America's devoutly liberal president. If that means more gridlock, so be it. That is a preferable offset to Barack Obama's agenda, which panders to his very liberal base." Now, this is pretty clearly kind of critical of the idea of him pandering to his liberal base, but the idea that if he believes this, and also many of his Obama supporters seem to still believe this 5.5 years after we talked about your book before his inauguration. Could you just riff on that a little bit?
Well, it's comic. I mean, it's kind of comic at this point. 5 years in, did anyone think so? So I was talking to my friend Glenn Ford once, who runs Black Agenda Report, which is a black left design magazine that's very critical of Obama from the left, and we both came upon the idea that there's almost a kind of a curious, strange bedfellows phenomena of, on one hand, Obama's sort of self-identified liberal, they would probably call themselves left supporters on one hand, and the Tea Party and the Republicans and the right wing and the far right wing, both of them have sort of bought together in their own different ways into this myth of Barack Obama as a left-leaning progressive. Some sort of European socialist-leaning, egalitarian friend of the working class and the poor and minorities and, enemy of empire and militarism and all this kind of business. And it's all just, I don't know any word for it at this point after everything that's happened in the last, 4 or 5 years of this presidency. It's just sort of childish. But, I mean, there was abundant evidence even before he was elected. And this is what I wrote my book, to try and preempt. This is what I wrote my initial Obama book, Barack Obama and the Future of American Politics. This is the myth I wrote that book in order to dispel, because I knew Obama from Chicago and Illinois before the national phenomenon. Because I used to work in the civil rights sector in Chicago and the South Side. I didn't have all kinds of dealings with Obama. And you don't rise up in Mayor Daley's Chicago and Rod Blagojevich's Illinois by being some sort of left-leaning progressive. And he certainly never did. And there are any number of very good investigative journalistic pieces that came out early on. There was a wonderful piece by Ken Silverstein in Harper's Magazine in November of '06. It was called Obama Incorporated. And it went back and looked at the vetting process and interviewed a lot of the top corporate lobbyists and big Washington, D.C. players who back at the very beginning of the Obama phenomenon in '03 and '04, when he made that famous keynote address to the Democratic Convention, and they bought into this phenomenon after finding that he was quite conservative in reality beneath the imagery. There was a wonderful in-depth piece in the New Yorker. I remember the date. It was May 7th, 2007, by a journalist named Larissa McFarquhar, and it was called The Conciliator. What does Barack Obama want? Something that was the title. And she had extensive interviews with him, an extensive review of his legislative record, and extensive interviews not only just with the senator, he was a U.S. senator at the time, but with his colleagues and fellows. And the portrait she portrayed of him was, in her terms, very deeply conservative, very skeptical about the notion that change could take place radically, through upheavals, through rank-and-file activism, through popular involvement, the types of activism that leftists talk about. And so this is why nothing in Obama has been remotely surprising to me, as he's described himself on more than one occasion as kind of an Eisenhower Republican, for all intents and purposes, or identified himself with Eisenhower for God's sake. It's hardly a leftist, and so pandering, to his base. Well, let's take immigration activists. More people. There have been more deportations per year under Obama than there ever were under George W. Bush. Peace activists. Oh, really? He's pandering to them? Well, I mean, we've had record-setting defense and military budgets under Obama. He's launched more drone attacks, murderous drone attacks on people in the Muslim world. He did more of those in his first 3 months in office than Bush did in his entire career. Obama has put special forces. He's located special forces, U.S. troops now in more than 120 countries. There were never U.S. special forces in more than 70 countries under Bush. And with the environmentalists, he's pandering to the environmentalists. He's okayed offshore drilling. He's militantly embraced hydraulic fracturing. He has been trumpeting the so-called all of the above energy policy, in the name of so-called national energy independence, which basically his main climate and environmental legacy now is that the United States is poised to bypass Saudi Arabia and Russia as the leading national producer of oil and gas. So our carbon footprint has increased dramatically. Is he pandering to labor? I mean, I don't think so. He's done absolutely nothing for the Employee Free Choice Act, which would have legalized unions in this country. He talks about this very kind of measly increase in the minimum wage, which he doesn't really do anything for anyway, to $10 an hour, when real labor activists are talking seriously about what people might be able to actually live in the country is $15 an hour. He's done nothing to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement to make it either more labor-friendly or more environmentally friendly, and in fact has pursued further so-called free trade policies and legislation. I mean, you could just go on and on. He hasn't lifted a finger for minorities. I mean, one of the saddest aspects of the Obama phenomena is all the talk surrounding the fact that we were ready to elect a first black president, Barack Obama. It's really the first half-white president in American history. And And minorities have absolutely nothing to show for it. There have been really no significant federal initiatives to do anything about just this astonishing wealth and income gaps between whites and blacks, gaps that have actually grown under his friends. He knows all about these issues very well. I know he knows about the extent of race disparity in this country, because he had to, but he was a legislator on the south side of Chicago. But, I could go on and on. So, pandering. I guess they're probably talking about, some things he said about gay marriage, and guns, probably because he has, because he did after the Sandy Hook shooting, a couple of years ago. He did come out to try to use the bully pulpit to some extent for some gun control legislation. I guess that's the closest I can see coming. Issues that matter to the people who really pull the strings in this country, he's done nothing. He's really done absolutely nothing. Liberals wanted single-payer insurance. They wanted single-payer, at least a health insurance program with a real public option to something, which is what most Americans have wanted forever. And instead, he rammed through this thing that ought to be its subtitle ought to be what the so-called Affordable Care Act, which does nothing to make health care more affordable, and probably ought to be subtitled the All Power to the Great Six Insurance Companies. I don't know what liberals and leftists he's pandering to with that piece of legislation, which basically was drafted by the Heritage Foundation of the Republican right wing.
So many, quote unquote, somewhat liberals don't want to brook any criticism of Obamacare because you want to help out the Republicans or the Tea Party? So, they seem...
we're at a point now where liberals have just become useless, as far as I can tell. I don't even know what liberals mean anymore. And so, what I've been hearing from liberals forever, as a leftist, and me and other leftists talk about this all the time, is to me, in a sense, a sort of proof that they're just sort of done. They're spent as a historical force, because back in the day, it used to be understood that that liberals, FDR understood that, and I think to some extent LBJ and Great Society liberals up through the 60s and to some extent beyond understood that they needed folks on the left out there. They needed some thunder on the left, so they could sort of point to it and say, that they could take on the right and fight big business, and maybe to get something kind of progressive done. Like pass the Social Security Act or pass the Wagner Act, which basically allowed the legal organization of unions in this country, or pass Medicare, or pass the Voting Rights Act and all that, because they could have a symbiotic relationship with us more rank and file, radical, leftist, direct action types of people out there. And it's sort of this. Now, what you hear from liberals all the time in universities, in unions, in nonprofits, online, is it's just kind of, you're spoilers, be quiet, shut up. But basically sit down and shut up. And, and what that tells me is that they're not serious at all about getting much of anything progressive. They don't really want to pass climate change legislation. They don't really want campaign finance reform. They don't really want, single-payer national health, real actual health insurance. So they wouldn't tell us to shut up all the time. They'd be using us. They'd be exploiting us to some extent. So we get this line all the time, if you make noise, or if you're critical of our environmental policy, or if you're critical of our surveillance policy, or if you're critical of our campaign finance policy, if you're, fill in the policy, right? If you're critical of our continuing of the military empire, which is this huge drag on social expenditures and on the economy. If you're critical of any of these things, you're enabling the GOP. So sit down and shut up so that the Democrats can beat the Republicans. And the irony of it is that as they push real progressives and as they push the left further to the margins, making it less likely that they're going to achieve anything that actually most of the population wants, because most of the population actually wanted real health insurance reform. Most of the population would like a significant increase in the minimum wage. Most of the population really would like to protect the environment. Most of the population, really would prefer, most working class people would prefer to be in unions and to have strong union rights. And I could go down the list of what, the public opinion data people show most people actually want. They want progressive things. What happens when the Democrats don't fight for any of those things? They don't seem to be for anything anymore. When liberalism has just become this kind of useless, defensive, lesser evilism, reduced to the qualification for voting for someone anymore has essentially been reduced to that they're not a Republican. I mean, when it's come to that, they don't evoke a lot of support. They tend to demobilize people. They don't get a lot of people behind them. Harry Truman used to say that given the choice between a fake conservative and a real red-blooded conservative, people will pick the real red-blooded conservative any time. And people are getting screwed out here. I mean, it's the distribution of wealth and income is in a distress level. And I could go on and on. The conditions people are living in are just getting worse and worse. And they're angry about it. And when you've got a bunch of liberals, so-called, I don't even know what the term means anymore, just trying to calm people down and tell them to stay on board, with the existing system in Washington. Because, hey, it's good because, we've got the first black president here, and he's supposedly a liberal, which he isn't. Say it. And so the message you get from what passes for the left is, be quiet and stay calm. And all the anger is out there kind of on the right. Well, then you end up you guys are lunatics. Don't get me wrong. Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, Glenn Beck, and that whole crowd. These people are nuts. But one thing about them is they're angry, and people are angry. And they're the only people articulating anger for a lot of ordinary folks. And you end up kind of like a situation that's kind of scary, like Weimar Germany, where the liberals were silenced and only the Nazis were articulating mass sentiments.
Yeah. In the preface to The Empire's New Clothes, and I think this relates to your broad assessment of liberalism that you just gave, and again, this Empire's New Clothes was written during or after the first year of the Obama presidency, but you said, I think it has been essential for U.S. voters and citizens, especially younger ones, to experience life under a Democratic presidential administration. The corporate Democrats, of which Obama is the new leader and epitome, are better able to deceptively pose as a progressive alternative to business class and imperial rule than the Republicans when they, the Democrats, are out of office when they are in power. But even though it should be obvious, the message doesn't seem to have sunk in even when they're...
Well, that's an interesting formulation you found, and I remember writing that. And I got to tell you, I sort of go back and forth on that. I do think that we got Occupy, and I think Occupy was an important progressive moment. And I do think we have some interesting public opinion data among millennials, among kids, that might shock a lot of older Americans. But it's amazing that in 3 different polls in 2011, kids, 18 to 29-year-olds, young adults, had a more favorable response to the word socialism than they did to the word capitalism. I mean, this in the United States of America. Imagine that. I attribute part of that to the end of the Cold War, to the fact that the Stalinist Soviet, nightmare dungeon state isn't there anymore for the right wing to point at and say, hey, that's socialism. But I think another part of that is that, Obama, and this would have been true if Hillary Clinton had got the Democratic nomination, she probably would have won in a way. But that a Democrat came in, claiming to be a liberal, whatever, a Democrat came in, and those kids had to see through the real experience that everything still pretty much stunk. That the rich just kept getting richer, the environment kept getting more destroyed, the Orwellian surveillance state continued to be as horrible as ever. They needed to see that kind of stuff is systemic and institutional. It has to do with class and race and the power system in this country that's evolved over centuries. Needed to see that was not just a function of the Republican being in the White House. And one of the reasons it wouldn't have any particular progressive positives to have a Republican in, because having a Republican just in the White House, having Republicans just feeds this kind of mindset that what's wrong with the country is that the GOP is holding power. So, in that sense, I wanted the Democrats back. And on the other hand, I think that lesson has been learned. I don't think it needs to be learned anymore. I would not get particularly excited about 2016. I'm not sure I care either way between the Democrats and the Republicans at this point. And, I think that Obama being in delayed rebellion and still continues to forestall and delay rebellion. A lot of people that I know on the lakefronts of Chicago, the famously liberal lakefronts of Chicago, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, or just fill in the blank in Collegetown, America, if a Republican was advancing the ecocidal and the imperial and the surveillance and the corporatist policies that Obama's been advancing all this year, they'd be in the streets. They'd be protesting. They just can't seem to find the gumption to do it. Why not Democrats in the White House? It was very clear to me when I lived in Chicago when the Iraq War was launched, and, thousands of people came out of their condos on the lakefront of Chicago, liberal Democrats. I don't know if they would have done that if the president had been Al Gore and Al Gore had decided to invade Iraq. So there really is this problem of people so-called progressives and liberals not being able to sort of wrap their mind around the need to protest and resist and to engage in activism when a Democrat is in the White House. Now, a lot of these people, especially the older ones, used to understand that. It was understood in the 1960s when LBJ was the president. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? They just can't seem to wrap their minds around the need to protest and resist when a Democrat's in.
Well, it is baffling to me, but I have to confess being a little enchanted myself. I had you on the show. I read your book before the inauguration. A congressional aide gave me a ticket last year to see him speak at a Ford plant in the Kansas City area. And listening to him speak, and, he had a podium and probably some notes, but he wasn't like reading them. And the words that he used were very engaging, and I was kind of silently to myself applauding what he said. What he doesn't match up, but he was so
the words
charming.
And the deeds. The words and the deeds. Chris Hitchens, I quote in one of those books that you've looked at, or maybe both of them. Chris Hitchens, back when he was a leftist, had a nice formulation. You could say the same thing about Bill Clinton. At least I've had that same kind of, that kind of experience of disconnect listening to Bill Clinton years ago. And Hitchens described the essence of American politics as the manipulation of populism by elitism. And he said it went back to Huey Long, promising everyone a chicken in every pot and everything else, and all this kind of, stuff that sounds like you're for the working people. But let's go back to Bill Clinton. He was beautiful at that. It helped to have a Southern accent and sound like a good old boy. That helped Bush out. That helped Bush sound a little populist too, when he could work that Texas twang in there a little bit.
Right.
You sound one way, and then you go back and you pass the North American Free Trade Agreement, for crying out loud.
Yeah, welfare reform, NAFTA, all that stuff.
And then you get rid of welfare reform. Well, a lot of white working class people didn't like welfare, but the fact is that you wipe away welfare entitlement, you're flooding the labor market with a whole bunch of unskilled workers. It just makes it worse for everybody. And the gap between the rich and the poor just absolutely skyrocketed up into this new Gilded Age that we're in right now. That started happening under Bill Clinton. Well, it started happening under Reagan and Carter, really, but it really reached new heights under him. So, that's nothing new. I got to say that I did not have that experience with Obama, and I think part of that might be, I didn't quite have the experience you described. I think part of that might be knowing him sort of from Chicago and the more kind of behind closed doors types of things where he always just bored the bejesus out of me. He was very academic. I couldn't stand him. The other thing is I was here in Iowa in '07, and I really covered a lot of the different campaign speaking events. And there really was an extraordinary populist, barnstorming, barn-burning speaker named John Edwards. I don't know whether he meant it or not. I'm not sure what was going on, but the guy was on fire. And he denounced corporate Democrats as well as corporate Republicans. And he talked about the 1%. He said, you know, he would say we're going to have an epic fight with concentrated wealth and power. And I mean, he damn near called for revolution out here in a lot of the campaign events. People are just going nuts. It was fiery. It was bombastic. I mean, it really was populist. You know, the rhetoric was really sort of extraordinary things that you'd have to be there to have understood what I mean. And then I go see an Obama event, and it was just dry and sort of dull, and I never got the whole excitement about Obama, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, maybe too, it's because I have a lot of history of exposure to real South Side of Chicago, black oratory, church oratory, the Reverend Jackson. Because I go back to that's where I'm from. I'm from Chicago. And I know what fire and brimstone is about and how it can mix in with politics. I remember Harold Washington, and I remember the real independent black politics in Chicago.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you right now, Obama didn't have anything to do with that, and was initially viewed with a whole lot of skepticism by the real black activists and political groups down there. And so I just never... I was inoculated against the Obama phenomenon pretty much from day one.
Yeah.
He kept saying he's from the South Side of Chicago. I'm actually from the South Side of Chicago, and I just knew it wasn't true. When he was running for the presidency, and he kept referring to himself as a skinny guy with big ears with a weird-sounding name from the South Side of Chicago, and I could feel this sinking feeling in my stomach because he's not from this. He's from Honolulu. He's from Columbia University on the Upper West Side. He's from Harvard Law. That's right. He had a short period of time in the South Side of Chicago, and I happen to know where his house is in the South Side because I live not too far from it, and it's like a mansion.
Yeah.
And it's a neighborhood called Kenwood, which is surrounded by other mansions, which is basically the neighborhood of the University of Chicago, which is the elite neoliberal capitalist university of North America. It doesn't have anything to do with the real, actual South Side of Chicago.
Right.
So that might seem like a minor thing, but those kind of little telltale lies are indicative of a deeper pattern of deception.
Yeah. I want to read another thing you wrote in the preface to Empire's New Clothes, but if you could bear with me on a long setup.
Okay.
Several years ago, my mother translated from Estonian to English first-hand account that my grandfather wrote. He was a 19-year-old officer in the Russian Tsar's army when the February Revolution broke out. He was on leave in St. Petersburg and witnessed all kinds of this events surrounding that firsthand. And of course, we now know that that revolution, which was kind of spontaneous, Stalin and Lenin were nowhere on the scene. They had nothing directly to do with that, but they were able months later in October to kind of take it over. And I couldn't help thinking about that when I read what you wrote in your preface to Empire's New Clothes. You said, I believe that the potentially left-leaning disenchantment that can result from that experience will not be effective unless and until popular forces develop considerably more capacity and willingness to organize for meaningful social change and political change from the bottom up. More than being merely meaningless, popular disenchantment could become dangerous in the absence of such development. Mass resentment abhors a vacuum. Without truly progressive institutions and ideas in place to channel energy in positive and democratic directions, popular disquiet and estrangement under Obama and the Democrats could just as easily feed a dodgy right populist proto-fascistic rebellion against supposed Obama's socialism. And I'm no academic historian by any means, but it seems like that's what happened to the February Revolution. There were no institutions or expertise in place to replace the czars, and that enabled the Bolsheviks to come in and do what they did.
Well, I think there's definitely an analogy there. I think there's a metaphor that works. I think in the American context there, that's me kind of presaging, sort of sketching out what's going to become the Tea Party phenomenon, where a lot of folks who really, if there was any kind of left at all, with real organizational presence, they could maintain its distance from the Democrats. They could capture a lot of that sentiment, and in the absence of that organization, and the Democrats have a lot to do with that. They make a point of discouraging that independent activity. But anyway, in the absence of that, yeah, the right can sort of pick that off. I think another thing that's being presaged there, or at least sort of there's a truism there that applies to a later development. And as you were reading that, I was thinking of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Where there was a rank-and-file rebellion led by the teachers in the Madison public schools, and a lot of the local unions around rebellion against this incredible right-wing governor and his attempt to abolish public sector unions in the state of Wisconsin. It was just incredible. In February and March of 2011, upsurge of protests from all over the state of Wisconsin, and then it came to go all over the Midwest, and people started coming from all over. And then it all got kind of channeled and shut down and taken over by what I felt at the time was this completely dysfunctional and doomed and idiotic campaign to recall Walker, which never had a chance. They were running a candidate who never had a chance. There's a lot of details or aspects of that are reasons that they never had a chance. But it was a classic case of social movement energies, the kind of energies that Howard Zinn used to talk about. Howard Zinn used to say, at the end of the day, it's not about who's sitting in the White House. It's about who's sitting in the streets, who's sitting in the workplaces, who's sitting in schools, right? Who's sitting in the town halls, who's occupying, who's engaging in direct action. It's just a classic case, Wisconsin was, of the movement. The energy required for popular social movement activity being sort of sucked into and co-opted by electoral politics. And even after the Occupy, I think it happened later that year, which was in October and November, which, by the way, was torn down largely by armed state power in mostly in democratic cities and with all kinds of involvement from the Obama administration, the Department of Homeland Security. The Democrats did everything they could to sort of co-opt the language of Occupy, and sort of even started talking about the 1%. And I could tell you all kinds of stories about the local Democratic Party around here just basically trying to parasitically coast on the energy of the Occupy movement at the same time that the Democratic mayors and Democratic city councils, and in fact the Democratic president, are preparing, engaged in the infiltration and the subversion and the shutdown of the Occupy movement. It's really quite sinister when you get down to it.
Yeah, I mean, there was a conference call of police chiefs and mayors across the country strategizing on how to do this. I mean, I wish the people...
Sure, passing around the basic concepts, make sure you talk about public safety. Make sure that everyone understands that we're shutting this down in the name of public safety.
Right. And I don't disagree with anything you said about Wisconsin, but I can't help but noting a president who, as this columnist in the Kansas City Star wrote, panders to his very liberal base, might have lifted half a finger to support something in Wisconsin.
You're absolutely right. If I'd written The Empire's New Clothes a couple years later, that would have been a nice little episode in it. So how Obama wouldn't go anywhere near even the relatively mild and conservative decision to just, try and recall the governor. I mean, that would seem to have made a certain amount of sense for Obama to have gotten behind that, and he couldn't even get behind it.
Yeah, I think he put out one tweet with some kind of very tepid words of support, and that was it. He did not come to town. Yeah. He did not speak about it.
There's some small print in the recall law in Wisconsin that if they attempt to recall you, you're the governor, and they attempt to recall you, you get this grace period of time where you're free to collect as much money as humanly possible. So Walker went on a tour of the billionaires of America and just picked up checks. Mm-hmm. The guy running against him, Tommy Barrett, never could have hoped to match. He picked them up from the Koch brothers and those right wingers. Walker did. And the other thing is to recall someone. The bar is a lot higher than just to vote someone out in the normal election. It's almost kind of like an impeachment. So even if most people didn't like Walker's policies, the anti-union policy, they weren't necessarily ready to recall him. See, so it was a very interesting moment in classic shutdown of the social movement and the channeling of it into electoral politics. And then when you lose in the electoral politics, it just kind of feeds this sense that it was all for naught. And it's just a small percentage of the money. That campaign, that recall campaign, ended up costing millions and millions and millions of dollars. Just imagine a relatively minor slice of that money going to movement activities, to rebuilding worker justice centers in local towns in Wisconsin, and building rank and file caucuses in the labor movement and so forth. What a misdirection of resources. We really need to build organization, at the grassroots level in this country.
You just sort of trod into the area of the next question I was going to ask. What have in Barack Obama and the Future of American Politics and The Empire's New Clothes, you get into the prescriptive area a little bit. What do you say now? What should real liberals, wannabe liberals, progressives, whatever you want to call them, what would be effective to try to do now?
Well, I'll tell you what's necessary to do now, and I'd like it to become effective to do right now, and I think that there's a kind of a game team that has been developing over the last 40, 50 years. It's coming to a position, to a point of almost over-determining everything else. And Noam Chomsky talks about this, that if we don't address the climate issue, which is a much bigger issue than just some uncomfortable weather every once in a while. I mean, it really has to. The people who really study what's going on with global warming and anthropogenic climate change are talking about fundamental changes in our relationship with the Earth that are, frankly, hostile to the continuation of the species. This is a very big deal. And a lot of the best Earth science that's out there says that if we don't fundamentally get off fossil fuels and reduce greenhouse emissions, we got about a generation to do so. In many ways, it could be game over long term for livable ecology, with the long term being understood, moving into the next century, for the viability, the possibility of a decent future for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. And we're already starting to see very significant changes underway in the natural environment. So greenhouse emissions. So, serious liberals, serious progressives need to get behind what's actually a core part of the Green Party. I realize it's not a particularly powerful party. It's not allowed to be under the existing campaign finance system. But the really critical aspect of their policy platform for years has been the Green New Deal. And that includes, among other things, massive, very significant public works programs, which, by the way, will put millions of people to work on the reconversion of the American and ultimately the global economic system off of fossil fuels onto what is, in fact, technically a very viable transition to wind, water, and solar. And one of the neat things about it is it not only saves livable ecology for future generations, It would be a huge job creator. And I don't know why I don't hear more about this outside of the Green Party and some sort of marginal sections of the left. There's all this talk about the need to grow jobs and effective demand and the need to have the public sector engaged. And, well, this is where to do it. We can transform our economy. It's been done in the past. Between 1940 and 1945, we converted thousands and thousands of automobile and bus and and manufacturing plants, and made the things that the world needed at the time most urgently, which was weapons to defeat fascism. And that was called World War II. It was called a conversion economy. Well, increasingly, we're facing the necessity of combating the single greatest existential threat to the species in the 21st and 22nd century. It's called climate change. And we could realistically tackle that problem in a way that would also put millions and millions and millions of surplus people, many of them very skilled, who don't have anything, that don't have any functions in society left anymore. We have a structural unemployment problem that's just insane right now. We put them to remunerative, socially useful, ecologically necessary work in public work. So I think we all need to get behind that. And I think at the grassroots level, our issue is organization. And we just are, a lot of people on the left are just sort of too focused on, writing blog posts, maybe writing books, maybe marching and demonstrations, and not enough on nuts and bolts kind of stuff, clipboards and knocking on doors and phone calls and rebuilding sort of grassroots power the kind of power that lasts from beneath and beyond one election cycle or one march or one demonstration or one political fad. And we're going to have to do that very quickly. We really have to rebuild grassroots networks around issues of social justice and livable ecology.
Paul Street, we just got a minute left. I don't know that we can address this sufficiently, but maybe you could take a stab at it. David Cobb, 2004 Green Party presidential candidate, was in town just a few weeks ago, and he talked about how facts really don't matter as much as they should. I mean, they matter, but not in terms of convincing people on what needs to be done. People go for stories, and with the major media, the stories are that global warming might be a problem, might not. Don't worry about it. With all the money in politics being further unleashed with Supreme Court decisions, we've got climate change is the number one problem, but can you do anything about that with bad media telling people the wrong stories and the 1% buying all the elections? Should we work on some of those issues to get to what you're talking about?
Well, Cobb, if I understand correctly, is talking about constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
I'm not against electoral politics as such. I tend to shy away from it. I will get wrapped up in it sometimes in local races where, it makes a difference. Got a county attorney's race right now that I think makes a lot of difference where I live in connection with racial justice. So I'll engage in it. But I'm almost completely agnostic and just left aside the bigger electoral politics, not because I'm against electoral politics as such, because I think the current money-dominated system doesn't leave any kind of reasonable spectrum of choices. Now, Cobb is talking about getting through constitutional amendment, I suppose a number of things, but one of them is getting private money out of public elections. I really think that has to be a critical part of our narrative and our story. Is the necessity. The social movements that I support are for having a type of political process that would be worth participating in. And one of the stories that I always find useful to tell about that is the mock elections that take place in schools and sometimes in local districts around the country every once in a while, where if you just had elections, there have been experiments run for this, run without major party labels and without candidate names, without candidate faces, without branding and marketing and all that, You just put up policies, and you include a party that basically, you put up the policy platform agenda of the Green Party, it wins. It wins every time. It's actually what most people would like. Universal health care, single-payer national health care, full giant public works programs for saving livable ecology, labor law reform so that unions can reorganize, very significant increases in minimum wage, limits on wealth inequality, limits on income inequality, all that kind of stuff. If you get rid of all the party labels and the names and the candidates, that's the one that wins. Every time. I think that's a very important little lesson there in that story.
Okay, well, Paul Street, I hate to, but I am going to leave it at that for now.
No, that's fine.
We've been talking to Paul Street. You can find out more about his books and other current writings and activities at www.paulstreet.org. And it's after 5.5 years, it's very good to talk to you again. Thank you for joining us on Tell Somebody. Well, that's it. We're out of time. You've been listening to the podcast edition of Tell Somebody, www.tellsomebody.us. Comments or questions, send an email to mail@tellsomebody.us. You can also follow me on Twitter @TellSomebodyNow. The Tell Somebody podcast is produced and distributed by Tell Somebody and may or may not reflect the broadcast of Tell Somebody heard on 90.1 FM KKFI in Kansas City, streaming around the world at www.kkfi.org. I'll be on 90.1 FM KKFI every Thursday morning at 9, right after Democracy Now! If you haven't heard Tell Somebody before, I hope you'll listen again. Check out the podcast and the broadcast. Click on a tile at www.tellsomebody.us for a link to a past show. If you enjoyed the show and appreciated the information you got from it, please tell somebody about the podcast and the broadcast. Spread the word to your friends and contacts by word of mouth or Facebook or Twitter or email list or any other way you can think of. This is Tom Clammer. I'll see you next Thursday at 9 a.m. on Tell Somebody or anytime you like at www.tellsomebody.us.